Good morning, New Life. It's good to be with you again today. As you can tell, we have gone back to doing our services online temporarily. We have had a COVID positive uh, individual in our congregation, and so we want to exercise caution and be responsible to you that it doesn't go any further than that. And so, for the next week or two, possibly, we are just going to be worshiping from home or wherever you can pick us up online. But anyway, it's good to be with you. As you know, lately we've been looking at the life of David. And really, when you look at life and all that's gone on with us with this pandemic and everything else that you encounter seemingly on a weekly basis, life never, in fact, rarely goes as planned. It rarely goes as anticipated. And plans are good. Everybody should plan. But as great as plans are, reality is greater than our plans. And sometimes things don't turn out the way that we had planned. And sometimes it's because of things that other people have done. And sometimes it's because of the things that we ourselves have done. But at the end of the day, what this means is that some of our dreams may not come true. And even worse, maybe some of our dreams can't come true. The fact is that the two of you may not have a happily ever after in your life. That you may never get the opportunity to walk your daughter down the aisle. That you may never have the need to purchase a high chair. Perhaps that second marriage is starting to feel just a little bit like the first marriage. That prodigal son or daughter may not be coming home. You may not be getting into that school. He's going to marry her anyway. She's going to marry him anyway. It looks like money's always going to be tight for you. It looks like that dream job is not going to be that dream job for you after all. And the thing is, depending on what kind of church you grew up in and what kind of religious background you have, if you have any direction at all, the fact is that sometimes our dreams, for most of us, begin to crumble and things aren't going in the direction that maybe we thought they would or wished they had. And as a result, there seems to be a sense of panic, maybe even a little bit of anger as a result of all this, because God promised you after all, right? I remember in my church up in Iowa, I had a couple that started coming back to church again. They were an older couple. And as soon as they started coming back to church and doing the things they knew they needed to do, it seems like they encountered one difficulty after the next. In fact, they called me and said, "It just seems like we're trying to do the right thing, and it seems like all this is happening to us." And that's the way it is for a lot of people. They begin to blame God for all the promises. It's almost like, because I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, God, you're supposed to take care of every aspect of my life. And so we feel like God kind of promised us that maybe God owes us because, after all, we're doing the things He wants us to do anyway. We're playing by the rules. We've done everything right that we thought we were supposed to do. We've behaved. We've waited, sort of like, the prodigal brother, not the prodigal son, but the brother, the older brother of the prodigal son, who stayed home. And then when the prodigal son came back, he got all angry because he had done everything right. He had stayed there, he'd worked, he'd done all the things that he believed his father wanted him to do. And as a result, he got very angry with his father because his father was now celebrating the return of his younger brother. There is sort of a cause and effect, isn't there? There's sort of like a sowing and a reaping. You did everything you knew to do things right, to play the game the right way, to live the right way, and yet still your dreams don't seem to be coming true. In fact, it looks like maybe everybody else's dreams are coming true, but not yours. So today, as we wrap up this series on the life of David, we're going to ask the question that David's life answers for us. What should we do? What do we do when our dreams can't come true? Now, as we have seen, David was in his 20s, and thanks to the behavior of crazy King Saul, David realizes that some of his dreams were never going to actually come true. He had a plan. God had made David very specific promises, but crazy King Saul decided that David needed to die. And consequently, David finds himself on the run in the wilderness, and it seems like everything else in his life is topsy turvy. And he did what a lot of us do when we realize that our dreams can't come true. He panicked. And when he panicked, he made one bad decision after another, and after another. And as a result, some people died. But during that season in his life, he learned a very important lesson. But as king, he would undermine his own dreams coming true. And the lesson that he learned in that season of his life is a lesson for all of us to understand. It's about 22 years after David had become king. He's in his 50s now. He's no longer the cool kid who had killed Goliath. Now he's in his 50s, and 50s is a pretty good age to be in, especially in our world. But in ancient times, 50s are old. You probably lost most of your teeth by then. You weren't young and handsome like you once were. In fact, even you begin to smell bad, sort of like the new car smell began to fade in your life. And again, David had been king for about 22 years, and he sent his men off to war. Now, we don't know why he didn't go. Maybe it's because he was feeling a little old and useless at that point, but he gets up in the middle of the night, and it's a famous story that we probably all have heard. And he looks down and he sees a woman bathing. Her name is Bathsheba. And he calls his servant over and says, "Who's that?" And the servant says, "Well, that's Uriah, the Hittite's wife." And David says, "Send her to me." Now, we all know that God had warned Israel. He said, "Don't have a king, don't have a king. I want to be your king." Because when you have a king, there are all kinds of problems that come with having a king. And one of the problems that you have with having a king is that no one can tell the king no. You can tell anybody else no, but you can't tell the king no. And so Bathsheba comes up to David, and everybody pretty much knows the story. They spent the night together, and they probably spent multiple nights together. And then she sends him a text message and says, "Hey, I'm pregnant." And David says to himself, I think I can fix this. So he calls for her husband to come home from the battlefield, and he says, "Give me a report of all that's going on right now, and as long as you're here, you might as well go home." But Uriah is a righteous man. And so instead of going home, he spends the night on the grounds outside the palace gates. David finds out why he didn't go home, and he says, "Why didn't you go home to your wife?" And he says, "How can I spend the night with my wife when the ark and the soldiers are sleeping in tents?" David says, "Spend one more night." And David gets him drunk. And then David says, "Now, Uriah, you can go home." The next morning, David gets up, and Uriah still hasn't gone home because Uriah isn't going to spend one night in luxury when all of his other friends are fighting a war. He's a good man. So David writes a message to Joab. Joab is Uriah's commander. And he says, "Dear Joab, put Uriah in the fiercest part of the battle, and when things get really hot, withdraw from him and his bodyguard." Basically, it was a death sentence. He signs it, he seals it, and then he gives it to Uriah, who then gives it to Joab. So basically, Uriah is giving Joab his own death sentence. Joab does what the king asks because no one can tell the king no, and Uriah dies in battle. Bathsheba mourns. David brings her in. She's pregnant. And it looks like David is this magnanimous, wonderful individual who is going to raise somebody else's child. He marries Bathsheba. Everything's good. David had managed the outcome, except that really, in a sense, there was no secret. In fact, in this particular world where there were slaves everywhere, the walls talked. And so eventually, after they married, the prophet Nathan makes an appointment with David, and he comes in and tells David a fictitious story. David is getting really, really, really angry at the particular person in this story that Nathan is telling. And then Nathan says, "Oh, by the way, David, this guy in the story that you're upset with, that's you." And it's at that moment that David breaks, and he allows the law of God to break him. And here's the problem, and I hope you listen to this real good. Every sin, whether you're a Christian or not, whether you're a religious person or not, every sin comes prepackaged with a consequence. Every sin comes with a penalty. And that day, as David began to mourn his own sin and own his sin, Nathan said this to him. This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household, I'm going to bring calamity on you. What you did in secret, although you did this in secret, I'm going to bring this calamity in broad daylight before all of Israel. Because you're a leader, you are accountable to the entire kingdom. And I'm going to bring about a consequence that everybody in the kingdom knows about. And then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. This is again a reminder that even though David was king, even though he was flawed, he never confused himself with the true king of Israel. He never abandoned God's law. Now, he broke it, but then he would allow God's law to break him. And once again, we find him acknowledging his sin and surrendering his will to God. He said, I have sinned against the Lord. And then Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die, but there is going to be an unavoidable consequence for what you did. You had someone who was innocent murdered, and you tried to hide it, and you tried to lie to the entire nation. So, 1 year goes by, nothing happens. 2 years go by, nothing happens. 5 years go by, nothing happens. And finally, 10 years later, the consequence takes hold, and it turns David's world upside down. And at the end of the story, David's dreams can't come true. David's oldest son was a guy named Amnon. And Amnon, because he was the oldest son, he was in line to become the next king of Israel. But Amnon was consumed with lust for his half-sister Tamar. Now, Tamar and Amnon shared one parent, but not two. And so Amnon just can't get her out of his mind. He's so enraptured by her. And apparently she doesn't even know exists. So finally he's done everything he can do to get her attention. And he's just so consumed with lust that he pretends that he is sick. And all of a sudden, all of his brothers and sisters, they all know something's wrong with Amnon. He's sick. He's very sick. And so he sends a message to David and says, David, is it okay if my sister Tamar prepares a special meal for me? And David says, well, that's fine. And so she brings a meal over. Amnon sends everybody out of the house, and now it's just the two of them. And he tries to talk her into going to bed with him. And he begs and he begs and he begs and he acknowledges, I'm not really sick. I was just trying to get your attention. And she resists and she says, absolutely not. No, my brother, don't force me. Such a thing should not be done. We're related. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing. But the text tells us, but he refused to listen. And since he was stronger, he raped her. This is so gut-wrenching. The people who are telling this story didn't skip any of the details. And the text says that Amnon hated her with intense hatred right after he raped her. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. And Amnon says, get up and get out of here. Well, she's devastated. She knows that her life is ruined forever. She's in this culture where she knows she will never be able to marry, and there were no secrets in the palace. In fact, so much so that even David finds out what took place. And when David finds out what his oldest son had done to one of his daughters, he's furious. And you know what he did? Nothing. He did nothing. Now we're only left to guess why David didn't do anything. But throughout his life as a parent, he just does nothing. But David had lost his moral authority. Who is David to tell anybody how to manage their private lives after what he had done? So David did nothing. And so now we're introduced to another one of David's sons. His name is Absalom. And Absalom is David's third son. The second son is out of the picture by this time, and we don't know what happened to him necessarily. And so the next in line to be king, if Amnon in fact is not king, would be Absalom. And Absalom is Tamar's brother by the same two parents. And Absalom takes Tamar into his home. She's broken. But as he takes her into his home, in regards to Amnon, Absalom does absolutely nothing. He never speaks to Amnon. He doesn't even act as if he exists. 1 year goes by, nothing. 2 years go by, and Absalom's so shrewd that when he thinks everybody has forgotten about what took place, he throws this big feast in his home, and he invites all of his family. He even invites David, and David says, well, I can't come. If I come, I'll be such a burden to your home. And Absalom says, well, it'll be okay if I invite all my brothers. And so David says, knock yourself out, y'all have a good time, because apparently David was from southern Israel. So Absalom still had this big feast, gets everybody good and drunk. And when Amnon is really, really drunk, all the brothers and families are gathered around the table. And then Absalom sends in his men to the dining room, and he murders Amnon in front of all his brothers. They all run for Jerusalem, getting out of there as quickly as they can. And Absalom heads up north into what we call Syria today. Now, when King David finds out about his oldest son that he's been murdered by his favorite son, King David does nothing. And life goes on. 3 long years pass, and David is beginning to miss Absalom. 3 long years. Things have settled down. Perhaps people have forgotten. Life's gone back to normal. And David invites Absalom back to Jerusalem. And when Absalom gets there, he was told, you're invited to move back into your home, but the king refuses to see you. And Absalom, for the next 2 years, tries to get in to see King David, but King David ignores him. And Absalom is so furious. You brought me back here. It's like I'm under house arrest. My family won't speak to me. Nobody will send my father a message. And he got more and more irate. So he sends his servants to Joab's farm. Now, Joab is the commander of all of King David's armies. He was the go-between, the liaison between David and other people. But Joab wouldn't have anything to do with Absalom either. So Absalom sent his servants to Joab's farm to burn down the entire farm. And so, as you might imagine, Joab goes over to Absalom's house and finally says, what in the world have you done? And Absalom says, well, it's nice to see you too, Joab. I've been trying to get a message to my father for 2 years, and you've ignored me. So now that I have your undivided attention because I burnt down your farm, would you please tell Dad that I want to see him? Well, Joab agrees and says, okay, I'll tell him. I'll work it out. Well, Joab's smart, and he knows that he can't approach David directly, so he sends a woman in. And this woman tells this incredible story, along the lines sort of how Nathan described a story to David earlier. And she gets David all engaged emotionally into the story, and especially at the end of the story, the person that David's most angry at. She says, King David, that person is you. You're upset with yourself. David knows what's going on. He said, did Joab send you? She said, yes, he sent me. So he sends for Joab, and Joab says, King, your highness, please see your son Absalom. He's waited for 2 years. So Absalom comes in before King David and bows down. David lays his hands on him as if to say, you're forgiven. Our relationship is restored. But it's not. Absalom is hurt, and David never calls. And the best we can tell, David never calls for his son ever again. Well, he's so angry, Absalom. He's so hurt. He decides to overthrow his father and take the kingdom for himself. He was next in line anyway, so he might as well take it now. So what he does, it's so shrewd what he does. Every day, early in the morning, Absalom would get up and set up a table and hold court right beside the gates to the main city. And anyone who was coming into the city to see King David to get justice for some cause, Absalom would say, "Well, let me help you." So he set himself up as judge and would stay there day after day after day after day, and would see all these people and take care of all these court cases by the people for weeks on end. And over time, it says that Absalom stole the people's hearts. For 4 years, he sat outside the gates of the city, and he would talk to anyone and hear their cases. People recognized how wise he was, what a great leader he was. And over time, as I said, Absalom stole the hearts of the people. And then 4 years later, he sets in motion his plot to overthrow his dad. It tells us that Absalom sent out secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel. And he says, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, then say, Absalom is king in Hebron. So he sent them all out. And on a certain time, on a certain day, you're all going to run through the city and just announce, Absalom is king, Absalom is king, Absalom is king. Now, there were no newspapers, there's no radio, there's no internet. So people basically believed whatever they heard. Maybe Absalom is king because David died. Maybe Absalom is king because David just abdicated and decided to let Absalom be king. We don't know. He had the hearts of the people. So when the people heard that Absalom had become king, they just rejoiced all throughout the kingdom, even though it actually hadn't happened. So 16 years after David's incident with Bathsheba, 16 years later, David's world is turned upside down. His firstborn has been murdered by his favorite son, who has now instigated a civil war and is about ready to divide the entire nation. A messenger comes to David and said, the hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom. And when David heard this, apparently he wasn't completely surprised. Maybe he'd been hearing the rumors that were milling around lately. But he says, come, we must flee the city, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave here immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin to us. And he will put this entire nation or this entire city to the sword. And if I stay here and try to defend this city, if Absalom takes the city, he will assume everyone in the city has sided with me, and he will put everyone in the city to the sword. So David abandons the throne to save the city. And once again, David is a fugitive. He finds him running from the place that he considered to be his home, running from the place where the people supposedly loved him. Once again, he's a fugitive, but this time he's not 22. This time he's 61 years of age. This was not his dream. This was not the way he wanted to spend the rest of his life. His dreams were not coming true. In fact, quite frankly, his dreams couldn't come true. And this is where, once again, our lives at some point connect with the story of David. Here we are. Maybe we're heartbroken, disappointed, maybe angry, frustrated with God, maybe looking for somebody to blame, and maybe you've decided, I'm going to blame God. After all, where is God? God could have kept this from happening, right? What's the point of going on? You hung in there with them year after year after year, and now look what they've done. You waited and you waited and you waited for what? You raised your kids right. You don't deserve to be treated this way. And look at the way they're treating you. You were honest. You were told that if you were honest, good things would happen in your life. And so I was honest, but I lost my job. You worked hard, but it really hasn't worked out. And this is, bottom line is, when we get to this point, oftentimes we make things worse for ourselves, don't we? And this is because we're so angry, we're so hurt, we're so frustrated with God, and we're so disappointed in God, and we hurt ourselves, which creates more regret, and we create more debt, and there's more pain relievers involved, and that there's more pain. And this isn't the first time that David had faced a situation like this. And David remembered because the first time he fled the kingdom, he took matters into his own hands. And he learns something along the way that we all need to take to heart. Here's what happened. David, the whole caravan of all of his family, anybody who was a supporter of David, they're now filing out of the city, trying to get out of Jerusalem before Absalom and his followers come in. The whole countryside, as they're watching this procession lead out, they're weeping aloud. The king and all the people were moving into the wilderness, and David didn't even have a clue as to where they were even going. And he just knows this: we got to get out of this city, and anybody who supports me needs to get out of the city as well. Now, Zadok, who was the high priest, Zadok was there too, and he was leaving the city with David and all the Levites. And this was the tribe that was taking care of the sacrificial system that were with him, and they were carrying the Ark of the Covenant of God with them. And this is very, very important. You see, the Ark of the Covenant of God represented the presence of God for ancient Israel. You couldn't get closer to God as far as ancient Israel was concerned as when you were in the presence of the Ark. And if you took the Ark of the Covenant with you into battle, you were sure to win. It represented the presence of God. And so when David saw them bringing the presence of God, bringing the Ark of the Covenant and the people of the city, it looked as if the presence of God was leaving the city and going with David. But the implications for that were a bit overwhelming for David. In fact, David decided this sort of feels manipulative. And this is what he said. He says to Zadok, take the Ark of the Covenant back to the city. Now, the people who were around David and heard him make this command or make this decision, I guarantee you they moaned. They did not want this, because one of the things that gave them courage and confidence was they were following the king and they were following the presence of God. And for David to command them to go back to the city, to take the presence of God, the blessings of God back into the city, was almost as if David was saying, Absalom is right and we are wrong. But listen to David's explanation as to why he told Zadok to take the ark back. This is so powerful. He said this: if I find favor in the Lord's eyes, I'm not going to try to manipulate God. I'm not going to try to talk God into doing something he doesn't want to do. I'm not going to play games. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it, the ark, in his dwelling place. Again, if God chooses to bring me back, God chooses to bring me back. But I'm not taking matters into my own hands. And so David said to Zadok, but if God says, I'm not pleased with you, David, David says, then I'm ready. I'm ready. And then he says, let him, talking about God, let him do to me whatever seems good to him. Not my will, thy will. Every time I do my will, I mess things up. Every time I have my way, I get in the way. Not my will, but thy will be done. This is the lesson, and this is so powerful. David lost his world, but he hadn't lost his confidence in God. David's entire world is upside down. He doesn't lose faith in God. He doesn't reject the law. He doesn't consider himself to be above the law. David understands he's flawed. He recognizes the fact that he's not perfect, but he refuses to be the king. He didn't lose his confidence, his faith in God. He chose not to abandon God when it appeared that God had chosen to abandon him. He says, I'm not going to war with my son. I'm not going to risk the city. This is not about me. God put me in a place, and God will choose how and when and where I am replaced. And then he leaves the city, and he leaves the ark. Wow. Absalom shows up at the city and takes the city without a fight. It's a hollow victory because he has the capital, but he doesn't have the king. And the only way for him to proclaim himself as the non-disputed king is to have his father put to death. Well, here he is. And then in walks another character in this story. His name is Ahithophel. Now, Ahithophel was probably Bathsheba's grandfather. And Ahithophel was one of David's trusted advisors. But Ahithophel changes sides when he realizes that Absalom's going to be the next king, potentially and the whole nation basically had followed Absalom. So he stays in the palace. David leaves. Absalom shows up, and Ahithophel is there to welcome him. Says, I am here to be your advisor, just as I advised your father all those years. I'm here to do whatever I can to help you, Absalom. And Absalom says, well, what should I do? What shall I do next? And Ahithophel gives Absalom this advice: do not rest here. Do not You need to get the men that you have and pursue your father immediately. Don't let him get organized. Don't let him gather more people around him. He's tired. They left in a hurry and they're not ready. They haven't set up any kind of defense. And if you go now, you can catch him. And when you catch him, you can kill him. And once he's gone, all the people who are left in the city with him will follow you back and you will be the king of Israel. But there was another counselor who was there as well. His name was Hushai. Now, Hushai had actually left the city with David, and David realized that Ahithophel was still in the city. And so he says to Hushai, he says, I want you to go back into the city, and I want you to greet Absalom. And I want you to pretend to be a great advisor to him as well. And I want you to frustrate the plans of Ahithophel, because Ahithophel is going to give him good advice, and I need you to give him bad advice. So he went back to the palace. And when Absalom met Hushai, he said, you've heard Ahithophel's advice to me. What do you recommend? And Hushai says this: the advice that Ahithophel has given you is not good this time. That was bad advice. Let me tell you what you ought to do. Absalom, think about it. You know your father and his men. They are fighters. He may be 61, but don't be fooled by his age. He's still a fighter. And he and they are as fierce as wild bears robbed of their cubs. Your dad is like a mama bear who's been robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced fighter. He's not going to spend the night even with the troops. It's not like they're going to catch up with him and find him. Even now, he's probably hiding in a cave or some other place. In other words, don't rush. Don't listen to Ahithophel. Take your time. Consolidate. Gather a larger army and wait. And once you gather all the tribes to yourself, then you can personally lead this campaign to overthrow your father. And Absalom thought that was great advice. And Ahithophel knew the end was near. He knew that if David is given time to organize and gather an army, there was no way that he would be defeated in open combat. You know what Ahithophel did? He just went home and hung himself. Isn't that interesting? David, in the meantime, goes to a city called Mahanaim, and he hears that Absalom is coming. He realizes he has no choice but to defend himself and to defend the people who are with him. So David does a very wise thing. He divides his army up into thirds, and he put a different commander over each third, and he gives them these very explicit instructions. When you catch up with Absalom's army, and when you catch up with Absalom, be gentle with the young man, for my sake. I realize this is war, but if there's any way that you can spare my son's life, I want you to spare his life. All the troops heard the instructions that the king gave to his commanders. David's generals insist that David not join them in the battle. So he stays behind the walls of the city, and he watches his soldiers march out to confront his son in battle. Now, the text tells us that this battle did not take place on the open plain, but it actually took place in the forests of Ephraim. And the forests of Ephraim, which meant superior numbers, meant very little. Experience and organization and communication mattered more. Unfortunately, David was wise enough. We don't know if David's men drew into the forest. We don't know why the battle was in the forest. But David's men were better organized to fight under these conditions because he had three commanders, whereas Absalom's troops were all looking to him for leadership. And it says there Israel's troops were routed by David's men, and the casualties that day were great. 20,000 men died, and the battle spread out over the entire countryside, and the forest swallowed up more men that day than the sword. Incredible. It tells us that eventually Absalom was caught, and instead of being held prisoner and taken back to David, Joab butchers his son as the army watches. And once Absalom was taken out of action, once the people knew he was dead, his army immediately stopped fighting. They threw down their swords and they all just went home. David is told that Absalom is dead. He mourns the loss of his son. In fact, he mourns the loss of his son so much that the soldiers were afraid to celebrate their victory. And Joab goes into David and says, David, what's wrong with you? The way you're mourning your son, it's like your men think they've lost. The men feel as if they wish they had died and your son had lived. So get over this and go out there and celebrate the victory. They just gave you back your kingdom. But it was a hollow victory for David because he loved his son. But he returns to Jerusalem as the king, but his world would never, ever be the same. And 9 years later, he died at the age of 70. Now, it really speaks to the authenticity of this account. The biographers seem to have done nothing to hide us from all of David's faults, his failures, his flaws. And the thing that is so amazing, the thing that I want us to take away as we wrap up this story of David, is that with all his flaws, he never lost his confidence in God. And when things didn't go his way, and it seemed to be like somebody else's fault, or when things didn't go his way and it was his own fault, with all that, he never lost his confidence in God. And David's somewhat sad ending reminds us of something extraordinarily important. So if you've been daydreaming or thinking about something else, I really need you to listen to this next part, because this is the takeaway. And it's simply this: the foundation of our faith is not answered prayer. Hear me. The foundation of our faith is not answered prayer. The foundation of our faith is not everything going our way. The foundation of our faith is not happily ever after endings. In fact, it's always a mistake to wrap our faith in God around the fulfillment of our dreams or even answers to our prayer. My dreams came true, so God is good. My dreams didn't come true. I don't think there is a God. It's always a mistake, because dreams that don't come true and prayers that don't get answered say nothing about the presence or the goodness or the faithfulness of God. They say nothing about God's presence or his lack of activity. And David, I think, of all the people in the Old Testament, would be the quickest to remind us that when we feel forsaken or mistaken, that when circumstances don't go our way, when our dreams can't come true, to assume from circumstances that God is not real or God is not present, David would say, no, don't make that mistake. Because through all the highs and lows, through all the ups and downs, God was with me. And we would do well with our own circumstances, in our own broken hearts, in our own anger, in our own dreams that can't or won't come true, to join David in this extraordinary statement that he makes when he's leaving the city. All hope is gone. He doesn't know if he'll ever see the city again. He doesn't know if he'll ever be restored. He doesn't know what's going to happen at this time in his life. But can you join with him with this one incredible statement? Even I don't know the future, but if I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him. In other words, not my will, but thine be done. I know how I want things to turn out. I know how I want things to go. I know I've prayed that they go a certain direction. I thought for sure they would go this way, but not my will, thy will. I may lose my world, but I will not lose my confidence or my faith in God. I choose not to abandon him, even when it appears that God has abandoned me. In fact, David wrote, this takes us all the way back to the first part of our series. We looked at that incredible statement, that declaration that he said. And maybe these are the very words that maybe we need to continue to remember. When my dreams are coming true, when they're not coming true, when they can't come true. In you, Lord, my God, I put my trust. My hope is in you all day long. And I'll tell you what's amazing. I wish we had more time to talk. Depending on where you are, you're seated. Maybe you've been around people that look good. They smile. They're your friends. But we're surrounded by people all the time that they were having had the opportunity to come up here and tell their story. It too is a story of heartbreak, a story of disappointment, a story of broken promises, a story of dreams that can't come true. And yet at the same time, we're oftentimes surrounded by people who have extraordinary faith and confidence in God because they haven't made the mistake of wrapping their faith in God around the expectation of how God's will should behave. And you say, well, what's the point of even believing in God? Because there is a God and He loves you. That's why, in spite of all that happens around us, we can say with tremendous confidence, not my will, but thy will be done. My point of the message this morning is maybe you have some things in your life that you'd always aspired to achieving. You had those dreams. Maybe there's some things that just went completely wrong. Maybe it's with family. You look around and you see families that it seems like it's just the perfect stereotypical family. Everything's wonderful, but it's not the same way in your home. I'm here to tell you, no matter what, God can be with you, and He is with you. You just put your trust in Him. Don't allow Satan to shake your faith. Even if your dreams can't come true, you can still trust in Him and know that He loves you very much. You can trust in Him and know that He's there every step of the way. Do you have that kind of faith today? Maybe today is an opportunity for you to take that one step and put your trust completely into Him. Your hope is in Him all day long. Let's pray. Father, thank you, Lord, during these extraordinary times. It seems like we take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or 1 step forward and 2 steps back. It just gets frustrating, and especially with things in our own life, Lord, it just seems so uncertain at times. And we think I deserve better than what I'm getting. And Father, I hope that, Lord, through the understanding of this story of David, that'll open our hearts and our minds to the reality of your word. That, Father, you want us to so trust you so that we can be an ambassador for you in a world that's living with hurt, disappointment, disenchantment. I pray, oh God, that, Lord, we will be the kind of people who demonstrate it doesn't matter if our dreams come true or not, as long as we have you at the center of our life. So, Father, may we not get discouraged today, but Lord, rather may we have hope that outshines anything that we've ever encountered and know that, God, you are always in control. We ask this in your Son's name, Jesus. Amen. God bless you. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.